welcome to the Boer Wars by Austin Hennings. I am Austin Hennings, and I will be leading you through this presentation today. This is my historical context presentation for Western traditions. Just a little preface about any information you see in the presentation at all, and you want to know more, feel free to ask. I've posted some links in the bibliography at the end, but if you really need feel free to check out right in the comments page or email me at austin.hennings@my.simpson.edu. I'll be more than happy to pass over any information you need. All right, let's get her started. On this first slide here, I'll be going into a little bit of background information about both the First and Second Boer Wars. Just in terms of talking about what type of warfare was being used, how it relates to modern war, and how both these wars were stepping stones for Great Britain heading into World War I. Well, as you can see on the screen, the First Boer War took place between 1880 and 1881, and this was also referred to from the Boers as the Transvaal Rebellion. They revolted against British annexation of 1877 when terms couldn't be met in terms of taxation, citizenship, and how people are treated. The Second Boer War, also referred to as the South African War, was much broader scale. It wasn't just between the Boers and the British. It was a combination of many South Africans, a combination of a number of English settlers from different countries, and played a huge role, as I've said earlier, into kind of shaping modern war and how we see it before World War I. Now, this war is interesting because it's a combination of old-fashioned warfare and modern warfare. In terms of old-fashioned, the First Boer War, took place on cavalry with horses, and the guns being used were still like flintlock guns, still being used with gunpowder. So the dynamic of war was totally different as in terms of the Second Boer War, where tanks and, I wouldn't say necessarily tanks, but moving machinery, so to speak, was a dominant factor, as well as different types of guns and modern guns. And the reason I say this is connected to modern warfare is because the media coverage in the Second Boer War was on a much larger scale in terms of who was fighting and how the media was covered, and I'll get into other things, other events of this war that were, so to speak, blown up on the world scale. Just one last point here. On the Second Boer War that took place between 1899 and 1902, it's also sometimes referred to as the South African War by historians and scholars because it it acknowledges and gives both groups of white and black races meaning in the war itself, as when it's considered the Second Boer War, it takes away from the African natives who died and perished in certain aspects of the war, whether it be in fighting, internment camps, or just living their daily lives. So heading into the next slide, as I said in the last slide, the Boer Wars go by a number of names. The British considered them the Boer Wars, the Boers considered them the War of Independence, and the native Africans, or Afrikaners, considered the Anglo-Boer Wars. As I've also said, scholars and historians consider them the South African Wars. And as you can see pictured there on the right, that is a group of Boers dressed and loaded, ready for battle. I will get into the Boers here on the next slide. When defining a Boer is defined simply in Dutch and African language. It is the word for farmer. They settled in the area of Transvaal and the Orange Free State after the 15,000 Voortrekkers, Dutch settlers, moved out of Cape Colony across the Orange River into the interior of South Africa to farm, to live, and to be away from the coast. They formed those two republics, which I just stated, but their lifestyle was a pre-capitalist society. They stock farmed, they supported each other. This is kind of why their government infrastructure was poor. This was also pre-gold rush, and as I'll get in later, gold was found across the Orange River, and a number of mines helped improve its economy greatly. But at this time, there was no gold discovered. Boers were there farming their lands and wanted to protect their lands. Now, to give you a little bit of an English background, I guess Great Britain, on South Africa and what their importance is, it also begins with the scramble of Africa that took place in the 1870s. Also in the mid-1800s and later on, as these countries and names and ownerships are changing all the time. But European powers attempted to colonize this area, leading to the British involvement during the late 19th century. They've had a complete stronghold on the area, as well as a number of territories across the world, whether it be Australia, New Zealand, India, and a number of many others. They wanted an unbroken line. That was their goal. They wanted unbroken territory from North to South Africa. They wanted to be able to travel from the Cape all the way to the north without ever leaving English rule. And as you can see on the map listed here to your right, Transvaal and Orange Free State are smack dab right in the middle of it. And you can see how they would be reluctant to join with English rule. And the English were a little bit of reluctance to join them, as there wasn't much there other than farmland and open crops and things that weren't too valuable to trade at the time. So there's time where things could be let go. This was obviously before the gold rush, which I will discuss earlier, and this was also before Transvaal instigated military contact. I guess the Boers themselves, who rest in this area, kind of revolted. So I'll get into that in this next slide. Now, I said the Boer people really opposed British rule. They didn't like the British people. And like I said, there were a number of Dutch settlers, and they had immigrated to that land long before the English. But they opposed British rule, and the government at the time of Transvaal was in trouble. And like I said earlier, in terms of paying their debts, consistent voting, things like that, the normal diplomatic errors took place, and the government was running out of options. But they participated in passive diplomacy all the way up until 1877, when the British put in an annexation on the area. They also upheld this annexation of the Boer area, and at that point, no holds bars, they turned to armed resistance. Now, the Boer army is a very interesting army. They're built on speed and precision, and a little bit of guerrilla-like warfare in this first war, but they knew the lay of the land, and that's how they were able to kind of attack this British infantry that came in. They were able to outsmart them because they knew where things were, they knew how to hide, they knew how to fight, and their weaponry, the way they used their weaponry, was a little bit smarter and more tactical. Remember, this is a number of farmers, and pretty much all farmers own some sort of guns, so they were excellent marksmen. So they might have been outnumbered, but they were more efficient with their kills. Now, it was made up of more of a citizen army. There were no uniforms worn. They wore kind of their own clothes. They were also unpaid for service, so really they're defending their land. It's a brigade or a militia, it's this group of people put backed into a corner who wanted to defend themselves. As you can see, the Boers utilizing these military tactics basically won the military aspect of this skirmish, or as considered the First Boer War. They lost one person and had 6 wounded, whereas the British had 87 men dead, as well as 5 officers dead, 123 men wounded, and 50 prisoners of war. But the real problems happened politically. On August 3rd, 1881, at the Pretoria Convention, taking place at the capital of Transvaal, kept Transvaal under British suzerainty. Now, I'm quoting BBC, the BBC article you will see in my bibliography. This vague concept meant that Britain retains supervisory control of the foreign affairs of Transvaal and of the internal legislation with regard to black societies. Now, this quote basically means they're leaving the farmers alone. They're leaving the people that want to be left alone, but not some of the internal regards and government companionship. So they were still playing a major aspect in the government. Now, at the London Convention of February 27, 1884, they were granted full independence, Transvaal was, thus becoming their own country and away from English rule. This is when things get very interesting. The Boers of the Transvaal and Orange Free State areas had just been granted their national freedoms. They were always considered a poorer nation simply because there's only farmland. That was their main economic resource and outsource. That's what they did. They were a group of lowly farmers. Well, this all changed in 1886 when gold and diamonds were discovered on the Whitewatersrand River. And now that was one more thing added to the economic pool. This allowed Transvaal, also Orange Free State, to have money. Their governments could actually be funded for the first time. And this was a huge threat to the British. They saw this as the Transvaal and Orange Free State people coming together and basically fighting off British rule in the area. Now, British settlers began to arrive and work in the mines as no big deal, but the British were still being looked down upon by the Transvaal people. Now, even though being a young country, they still had their viewpoints and opinions on the British, and they weren't great. But things escalated a bit when Cecil Rhodes, Prime Minister of Cape Colony, attempted to overthrow the Transvaal government in 1896. He failed doing so, and thus creating a large number of Afrikaner nationalism, and that began to grow amongst his area at the time. Now, an alliance was formed between the Orange Free State and Transvaal after this happened. Now, there's multiple takes on the alliance, obviously. Transvaal and Orange Free State, the representatives would say this is sheerly for protection. We're not going to allow ourselves to be thrown around by British rule. But the British saw this as, we got two guys teaming up, ready to attack. And so this leads us into the next slide. Now, after all this happened, there wasn't much left to do other than solve it diplomatically. That was the hope of both sides. The Boers wanted to protect their way of life, their rich Dutch history, something they had fought for. They had fought off other African natives, and they had just fought off British rule a few years earlier. But they resisted British laws, including anti-slavery. They wanted to have slaves. They needed people to work the fields. Also, now the newly founded mines. They didn't grant rights to Brits coming into the country because they didn't want that extra group of people. The British reasons for them being angry at the Boers was their continued attempts to conquer them. They encouraged settlers to move to the Boer republics in terms of getting a number of English people in there and grow. And pretty soon, the small number of Boers will outweigh the large number of English. They didn't want the Boers to grow into an enemy. And that's what was slowly happening in their eyes when they signed an alliance with the Orange Free State. Now, steps towards war, British demanded these rights. The Boer President Paul Kruger presented an ultimatum, and ultimately both sides disagreed. And October 11th, 1899, war broke out, and this was the same day that Paul Kruger, who's there pictured right, presented the ultimatum. Now, the Orange Free State, who had earlier joined Transvaal in their alliance, they had just now, they're being called to action, so it's time for war. The South African War begins. Now that the war was underway, The Boers got off to a strong start. They won the first few battles in the war, and they actually dominated the first couple of months because of the advanced weaponry they had gotten from the Germans. They had purchased this weaponry with their newly minted mining company. They actually had the money to fund an army, so they were able to kind of get off to a fast start. Now the British rolled with the punches and got through the first couple of losing battles because they had the numbers to do it. They overtook Orange Free State in a matter of months. By 1900, that happened. Other wins followed, but like I said, the sheer numbers they had was over 450,000 men, with contingents from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India, as well as Great Britain. Thus putting the Boers in a situation where they were losing too many men. And when numbers became scarce, they resorted to guerrilla-style warfare, where they're hiding, trying to get people with low numbers, and trying to basically scatter fighting. Now, the British resorted to the scorched earth tactic, and this is when a lot of the media starts being brought up into how wars are won and lost and ways to do it properly. Well, they did a scorched earth tactic where they came in and they burned all the farmland, they pillaged cities, they, like I said, destroyed these farmlands, killed livestock, basically taking every natural resource away from this people and just die them out, just kill the rest of them. And the casualties were left with 22,000 men lost from the British side, 13,000 were from disease, and the Boers lost 7,000 men in the field. And this also takes me into another avenue the British took that was questionable, is they formed these concentration camps. And I'll get into that in the next slide, but these concentration camps lost over 27,000 women and children, and then 20,000 native blacks also died in the concentration camps. But yet, at the time, this number went unspoken of. Just the 27,000 men, women, and children were discussed, and over 35,000 Boers altogether. Now, why this scorched earth strategy was taking place, behind the scenes were concentration camps that were organized by the British Army. And these aren't necessarily what we think of in modern times of what a concentration camp is. We're not Nazi-occupied Europe where the Jews, gypsies, and numerous other people at that time were killed, and the main point of these concentration camps was to kill, maim, and basically end a group of people. The problem is these concentration camps were handled so poorly. The British didn't prepare for the number of people, lack of food and supplies, and the spread of disease, typhus, and cholera. And this reflected bad on the British, and from a world standpoint, and especially world leaders and how wars are won and lost. And this was led to national press. Great Britain was being condemned by other major countries for the way they approached this. And then also many native Africans died, but like I said, this was unreported because of racial tensions at the time. And this is a topic that comes up much later and is also the backbone of major South African reform. The aftermath of the South African War is something that is still being felt to this day, especially in that part of the world. But the direct aftermath was that the Orange Free State and Transvaal were given to the Empire of Great Britain with a chance to one day self-govern. Britain paid reparations for damage done, which was upwards of $3 million at the time. I do not know the number for inflation, but I'm sure it is a lot. There was very little celebration in Britain as the war became unpopular due to the media coverage. The worldviews of Great Britain deemed their victory barbaric. It was awful. The sheer human rights that were violated. And this caused political unrest for a prior conservative government. Also, social reform in choosing military was changed in Great Britain, as many men were unfit to serve. And at this point, Afrikaner nationalism used these actions to promote nationalism, and especially Native African nationalism. And there's a quote I found here from Guillemey and Mbenga. The South African War, aka the Anglo-Boer War, remains the most terrible and destructive modern armed conflict in South Africa's history. It was an event that in many ways shaped the history of 20th century South Africa. The end of the war marked the end of a long process of British conquest of South African societies, both black and white. So the effects of all people in this area, whether it be British, Dutch, Native African, Anglo-Saxon, which covers all white people, but the world was affected by this. And it really changed the way of how we view war and how war is covered, and definitely led as a stepping stone into World War I in the way Great Britain chose sides in World War I as an ally, especially going into World War II, and the way we do fighting today. This portion of South African history is what we're more informed to today as a modern society. The eventual impact is the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910 as a British dominion, sort of like Canada, and that's how it was for a number of years. The Boers formed the most powerful voting bloc within the country, and in 1948 they formed the apartheid, a system of government which introduced racist policies against minorities, much like Jim Crow laws in the United States. This caused South Africa to be kicked out of the British Empire and become a republic. Now, the apartheid fell apart in the 1990s, and South Africa is now ruled by a black majority. And much as you know, in 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected president, who currently died as recently as 2013. And right below is the current South Africa flag. So the country has come a long way. Peace is still a part of what they do, but the racial tensions are still alive, as many people still regard themselves as Boers and still afflict themselves with racial tension. But it's much more peaceful than it was, and the Boer Wars played a huge impact on that. I'd just like to thank everyone for tuning into this presentation. I hope you learned something you didn't know. I know there's a vast number of much information that I didn't even divulge into. You can definitely learn a lot from the bibliography here in the last section of the page. And I hope this was informational as well as a productive use of your time. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the class and have a great year, everybody. Thank you. I'm Austin Hennings.